Well, first of all, this is not our parents' Cuban Missile Crisis. For the first quarter century after 1962, I mean, until the late 1980s, what Americans knew, and most Americans still know of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is 13 days. You know, this was, of course, the title of Robert F. Kennedy's posthumously published memoir after he was assassinated in 1968. And of course, this was the Hollywood version, where Kevin Costner saved the world. And the 13 days was the Americans discover that the Soviets are constructing nuclear missile sites in Cuba on October 14th, Sunday, October 14th, 1962. 2 days later, JFK is told, to his great surprise, and he's very upset about this, but that's the first of the 13 days, which end on Sunday, October 28th, when Khrushchev agrees to withdraw the missiles. And what most Americans knew for the first 25 years, and a lot of Americans still know, is the story of Camelot, of JFK on the nuclear precipice, consulting with his advisors, making the decisions, eyeball to eyeball with the Soviets until the other guy blinked. And 99% of the story that most Americans knew was an American story. Then beginning with Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost in the late 1980s, and then moving into the early 1990s with the Soviet collapse, you began to finally get a much better view of the Soviet side of the event. And that led, in the last 20 years, to some very good books in which Soviet decision-making and Soviet actions are recounted in a much more rigorous and nuanced way to balance the American story, which has changed much less, but also to better understand the perceptions and misperceptions of both sides. And also you began to get a Cuban version. You could call that the second wave of understanding the missile crisis. And that was extremely significant. For example, I would say, if the one most important revelation of the last 20 years began to emerge literally the week the Soviet Union disappeared into history and was replaced by Russia, the end of 1991, the beginning of 1992, which is the fact that the Soviets had not only sent the medium and intermediate range missiles that could hit most of the continental United States from Cuba, but had also sent roughly 100 tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba and their warheads that could be used in a nuclear battleground to fight off an American invasion. And that cast the entire crisis in a new light, because it's well known that Kennedy, at least when he was trying to deal with Khrushchev, gave the impression that he was very close to an invasion of Cuba. And this has raised the question, if the U.S. had invaded, would they have faced a nuclear counterstrike? And of course, when American former officials learned about this, they said, had that happened, the pressure on JFK to escalate to full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union would have been almost irresistible. So that was the second wave. What I think now is beginning is a third wave that really tries to globalize the history of the crisis. Where did this fit into international relations at this crucial moment? Where does it affect the Sino-Soviet split which is emerging? Where does it affect the possibility of war in South Asia? How does it affect the progress of revolution in Latin America? Because, in many ways, the battle over Cuba was not just over Cuba. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were concerned in opposite ways that there would be a second Cuba. And that might be, for example, Brazil, which had a center-left government that the Americans were very suspicious of. JFK's nightmare was Nikita Khrushchev's dream, which is that Brazil would be the second Cuba, possibly within a few years. And so there are many different ramifications of the missile crisis beyond simply sitting around the table at the White House and contemplating, what to do about the quarantine and, the old story that most Americans are familiar with. The history has gone in many different directions, and with sources that now make it possible not only to explore new issues, but to understand some of the key characters in a much more vivid way.